Good evening, everybody. All right, got it. So my name is Harry Ships. I am a vice president at a little company called 90 West. We are here in Boston. We're a strategic communications consulting firm. We do a fair amount of political work. We work with Congressman Ayanna Pressley. We've done a number of other campaigns over the past several years. We also work with a number of nonprofits and foundation folks, helping them on everything from developing their message and how they talk about themselves to actually executing all that and working with reporters, helping them draft op-eds, LTEs, written content, working with them on their social media strategy, sort of all of the above. So it's given a sort of great breadth of experience. I've been at 90 West for about 5 years. It was started by Alex Goldstein, who was a longtime advisor to Governor Deval Patrick, and then went out on his own and started 90 West. Prior to that was in DC for a couple of years doing policy work, and prior to that worked on campaigns here in Massachusetts. I'm originally from the North Shore, so Massachusetts is home, and I'm very glad to have been back for the last 5 years. I will say I am battling an early season cold, so if at any point you see me mute myself or turn off my camera, it's only because I have to sneeze or cough, so please forgive me for that, but I've got my tissues and my bottle of water here, so we should be okay. So yeah, as I was saying, Chris, thank you for leading me into the intro even before we got started here. But planning to go for about 20 to 30 minutes and run through a sort of training presentation that we provide to a lot of folks, political candidates, folks working in nonprofit and foundation settings, about strategic message development and communication strategy. So we will go over that, run it through. When we are in person, it's typically a little bit more interactive. It's harder to do virtually. So it will be a lot, and I apologize in advance, of sort of me talking and presenting things. I think as Chris alluded to, if folks have questions during the presentation and want to, something that doesn't make sense or want to go back over it or dig a little bit deeper, feel free to drop those in the chat. I will do my best to pay attention to them and answer them in real time. And also, again, if folks need me to slow down, please say so. But then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for any questions folks may have. Again, things we didn't cover, specific questions. I see Kirsten already dropped one in here about messaging to counter Republican talking points in the culture wars. So anything like that maybe we haven't specifically addressed during the training, feel free to hold on to until we get to the end, and then we can talk about whatever is sort of on folks' minds. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get this slide deck up here. So bear with me for 1 second. All right. Beginning. Can folks see that? The thumbs up. Anybody can see that? Okay, perfect. I can see Mary, so thank you for that, Mary. All right, so persuasion training for the mass Dems. So the place I really like to start this is at this sort of very simple graphic that we call the Transcendent Persuasion Trio. And I want to specifically call out the word persuasion because I think, oftentimes we talk about messaging or communications or words like that. I think what it comes down to in almost all of the trainings and conversations that we have with folks is that the real goal here is persuasion. And I think this audience, the folks on the call tonight are probably uniquely familiar with this because a lot of the work that you all are doing is persuading people on the doors, on the phones, talking to voters, people who are coming to events, right? We are trying to persuade them of something, whether it's to vote for, our candidate of choice, to volunteer, to come to an event. The goal here is oftentimes, or almost always, to persuade somebody of something. And so we like to talk about these sort of concepts in the umbrella, or under the umbrella of persuasion. So then looking at the triangle itself, or this graphic on the left hand here, you see, so message, which obviously we'll dive more into throughout this training, is sort of how do you talk about yourselves? What messages are you trying to convey to people? What are sort of the most important things that you want to say about the work that you do, about the moment that we are in, about the priorities that your group or you as an individual feel are most important? So that's the message piece of this, is defining what those things are. And we will get, again, more into that. Second piece in the bottom left here is audience. So who are you talking to? And this is, I think, a really active piece of this. Oftentimes it feels like audience is static, like audience is this big blob of people that we can't necessarily define or understand. I think the way we think about it is that understanding your audience, who you're trying to speak to, is something that should sort of be a continual process, right? Thinking about who is it that we're really trying to reach with the messages that we've created, and how do we do that? And the how do we do that is the vehicle piece here. The vehicle piece refers to all of the sort of communications tools that you all have at your disposal. And again, we'll go a little bit deeper into this, what falls under the term vehicle. But it is matching up the message that is resonant and strong and powerful with the audience who needs to hear it, and the vehicle that most effectively delivers that message to them. If you can get all those three things right, you're going to be in a really good spot to persuade people of whatever it is you want to persuade them to do, or action to take, or what to think, or what to prioritize. So that is sort of the foundation from which the rest of this is built. All right, so I'm going to move on here. See if I can get to the next slide. There we go. And one thing I also want to mention is, as we sort of get started here, is I've been talking with Stephanie and Gus about this training and about this group, and they had been sharing with me the idea of sort of this blueprint concept, right? That the work of organizing and bringing people into the party and doing this work isn't necessarily tied to a specific election cycle. It's not tied to a moment in time. It's really work that happens all year long, happens around the calendar, in all sorts of different settings, in all sorts of different contexts. And so what we are thinking about, and I think what this message training is designed to do, is really to help think about a message development strategy and a communication strategy that are sustainable and applicable in a lot of different places, right? In a lot of different settings that aren't tied necessarily to a specific moment in time, or a specific election, or a specific candidate, right? We want to think about messages that really can be used sort of whenever and wherever they need to be. See, excuse me. So let me cough and take a sip of water here. All right. So, excuse me. So we want to think about sort of what makes an effective message. And I think there are sort of 5 elements of this that we'd like to really drill down on. Emotion, you can see them all here. Emotion, credibility, repetition, control, and risk. And so we're going to dive in a little bit to each of those. Excuse me. Whew. This was bound to happen. So first one is emotion. I think, again, as you think about this is probably not going to be super new, right? This is probably something that we're all sort of innately familiar with. But as we think about messaging, a message that has emotion in it is really, really important, right? To grabbing people's attention, to making them feel compelled, to being something that is resonant. And there are lots of different emotions we can use to do that. I think one that we see a lot these days is fear, especially from Republicans. We see fear used as an emotion in messaging all the time. If you don't vote for us, this is going to happen, or this terrible thing is taking place. That's Democrats' fault. You should be frightened of X, Y, and Z kinds of people. You should be frightened of X, Y, and Z kinds of policies. And that should make you do X. That is really a foundational piece of Republican messaging. Similarly, anger. You should be angry that this thing is happening, and therefore you should do Y. But there are lots of other emotions that we can use as well. There is hope, there is empathy, which I think is a really important one, helping people sort of understand and identify with what you are talking about, with the people that we are talking about in our messaging. Optimism about what we can all do together, determination, confidence, humor, all of these. And I think, if we were to open it up here to the group, I imagine that there would be a lot of different, folks who would come up with different ideas about what emotions they think about in messaging, or what emotions they've felt that really, resonate with them. So, emotion is sort of one key piece of an effective message in our mind. Chris, I apologize. I just pulled up the chat and saw your question. Chris's question is a vehicle just a new way to say medium? Is there a conceptual difference? I think those are very similar, Chris. Vehicle and medium are essentially interchangeable here. Apologies for not catching that earlier. So hold emotion as one really important piece of our message. And let's talk about credibility. So I think, oftentimes what folks run into, and what is a challenge when it comes to crafting an effective message, is that they lean either too heavily on emotion, and it's all emotion, or too heavily on what we're going to call here credibility, which is more about sort of how do we give meat and substance to that emotion, right? So if I tell you to be afraid of something, or if I tell you to empathize with something, or if I tell you to be hopeful and optimistic about something, how do we back that up with something that says both I know what I'm talking about, and also this is why you should believe that that emotion is credible, right? And I think there are a number of different ways to do that. There are first and third party statistics, right? So that is first party statistics would be us saying, we have this statistic that says X, right? So if I am the messenger and I'm saying, you really need to pay attention to this because we are seeing that X number of people are doing Y thing, right? Or if I'm saying that, this is really important because last election we saw that only 20% of people turned out for a given election, right? That's a first party statistic that gives credibility to what I'm saying and what I'm asking someone to do. Third party statistics would just be bringing in that kind of concept from elsewhere, right? Like maybe we're all familiar with Mass Inc. or Channel 5, WCVB, or whatever it is, and saying, they found that X. And so that illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. That's certainly one way to give credibility to that emotion, right? To back that emotion up with something. Similarly, validation. So this is, I think, it's saying, having someone who can validate you as a spokesperson and say, this person, or I share this person's view and I believe what they are saying. That can obviously vary. It can be sort of other people within your organization. It could be people external to your organization. It could be elected leaders you worked with before. It could be partners that you are working with on a particular effort or a campaign, who could say, this person has been there, has done that, understands the concepts. And so, we should listen to what they are saying. That's sort of a personal validation of you as a messenger. And again, just backs up what you're saying when you're bringing emotion to the conversation. First and third party storytelling, I think, is a really important one, and it differs a little bit from validation. So I think, one really effective way to make emotion credible is to tell the story of what you're talking about, right? So statistics are great, but oftentimes they mask a more personal, more effective, more compelling story. So while you might be able to say, because, or while you might be able to say in the most recent election, only 20% of voters turned out. Another way to validate that would be to tell the story of someone who didn't turn out and why, right? And that could be, you could tell that story if that is your story, or there could be someone else in the community, someone you work with, someone again, someone in the organization who has that story to tell, who could say, I didn't turn out because I didn't feel, like I had a stake, like my voice mattered, like, like I had time, like I had to go to work. Any of those things, excuse me, give credence to the idea that, there's an emotional and a real world impact to these things that, again, helps sort of back up that emotional storytelling with, like, here's a real tangible example of what that means. And I certainly find in the messaging that we do that storytelling is probably the single most powerful way to, really help people understand, the impact of the message, to help them understand the urgency of it is through that storytelling. It just resonates better than statistics or even validation, I think, in most cases. The last one is physical credibility. This goes a little bit more when we are giving this training to, candidates and folks who are out in community constantly doing sort of like earned media interviews and things like that. We often want folks like that to be in places that sort of tell a story in themselves, right? You don't necessarily want to do an interview in front of a blank white wall. You'd much rather do an interview out with people in the background, sort of giving credence to the idea that what you're saying is not just you, but that there are other people behind you, or that you understand what's going on because you're physically in those places. So that's a little bit, more about, like, if you're doing an interview or if you're doing something that's on camera or on the radio, it's a little bit less, obviously, we're talking about like email or social media or things like that, but also we're thinking about, how do you incorporate visuals or events in places that sort of speak to the messages you're trying to tell, right? Those decisions can be really, really important in reinforcing those things. Chris, also seeing your question here about second party. So I think when we're using first and third, we're just talking about first person being, statistics or validation or storytelling that you are doing as the messenger, and third party being about somebody else doing that for you, either somebody else telling the story, somebody else providing the validation, or somebody else providing the statistics, right? So second isn't excluded. It's just, we're talking about either ourselves as messengers or somebody else, anybody else in the world doing those things. All right, so that's credibility. We'll keep going here. So control and risk. Again, I'll spend a little bit less time on this one because I think it's a little bit more nuanced and maybe not quite as important, I imagine, for a lot of the communications that y'all are doing, but I think it is important to understand, right? Which is, I think we look at different communications channels or mediums, as Chris was offering, on sort of a spectrum, right? At the bottom of this chart, or the bottom of this continuum, as you see it here, is what's written there is digital, video, and email, right? So I think those are examples of communications mediums where we have maximum control, right? In a video or an email, you can literally craft every word that goes into that, right? You know exactly what's going to be said. You know exactly how you're going to say it. You know exactly what context you're going to provide. And that provides a ton of control over what the message is. It does, I think, tend to lower emotion and credibility, right? I think, we all experience this. At the end of every quarter, we get bombarded with fundraising emails from candidates and others. Those emails are all really tightly controlled. The candidates and their campaigns get to pick everything that goes in there. I think, I can imagine that a lot of folks may find those like a little bit less compelling than some other kinds of communications that they see from folks, right? Like that may be a little bit less compelling than when you see a candidate in person or when you see them doing an interview or anything like that, right? So the emotion and credibility factor on those kinds of communications is typically less, which is totally fine. And there is a place for all of these in any sort of comprehensive communication strategy. It's just something to keep in mind, right? You're not going to get the same sort of resonance usually from those really tightly controlled pieces of communications. The other end of the spectrum are things like media interviews and panels, where you have much less control over the message. You have some control, and we'll talk about how that happens a little bit later on here. But if you are doing an interview with somebody, or even if you're engaging in a one-on-one conversation, which I imagine many of the folks on this call have tons of day in and day out, right? You don't necessarily know what questions are they going to ask, what perspective are they going to come into the conversation with, sort of what biases are they already going to have that you're going to need to address or take down or get past. And so that gives you a little bit less control, or much less control over the direction that the conversation takes, and makes it more of a challenge to get back to the sort of core messages that you want to be communicating. At the same time, usually in those settings, you have the ability to have higher emotion and higher credibility, right? Because you are either physically in front of someone, or you have the ability to do real impactful storytelling. You are engaging in a way that's dynamic. And so that allows for more emotion and more credibility excuse me, in those conversations. And that's important too, right? Because that's how, maybe you get folks who aren't as deeply invested in this engaged. Maybe that's how you reach new people. But again, it's just something to think about as you are thinking about communications, is sort of where do these fall on the control versus risk spectrum, and how do I prepare with that reality in mind, right? Like, what should my communication strategy look like depending on where this falls on the continuum? Social media, I think, is an interesting one, and it's in the middle here because, while obviously we control the actual words that we tweet or put on Facebook or, put on Instagram or what have you, we don't then control what happens to those. Instagram and Facebook and social media platforms generally can be, again, really unpredictable, dynamic platforms. And so, things that we expect to have a particular impact may go sideways really quickly. And so the message may change really drastically depending on how sort of the platform metabolizes whatever we're putting out there. So we have control in what we say, but not necessarily control in how it's received. And so that is, something that's important to keep in mind. All right, I'm not seeing any questions on that, so I will keep going through this. I'm just going to time check myself. Okay, 6:25. Lost my cursor. Oh, I gave it away. All right. So the last of the 5 elements that we talked about was repetition. And I think I probably can't say this one enough. This is my hobby horse when it comes to effective communications, especially nowadays. When we are doing this with candidates, we tell them that by the time the campaign is over, or by the time whatever sort of effort we are undertaking is over, you will have said the messages that we want to get across so many times that you will be sick of them. And I think that is true in most settings, right? Given how much news and information people are receiving every day at this point, to break through that, especially if you don't have, $500 million to put behind paid social media ads or something like that, repetition is key. Being sort of on message all the time or as much as possible, and not being afraid to continue to come back to the same idea, the same concept, the same message in conversations, in your social media, in your emails, newsletters, in whatever ways you are communicating with people, being sure that you are hitting those messages over and over and over again. It may seem ad nauseum, I think, to the messenger very often, but to folks who are receiving that, that's how these messages break through. I think, excuse me, a lot of folks will say things like, a voter has to see the same message 7 times or 12 times or 15 times before it really breaks through. I don't know that we can ever really be that formulaic about it. Sometimes, sure, it takes that many times. Sometimes someone will see one really compelling thing and that'll be all it'll take. But generally, repetition is really, really, really important. And doing it even more than you think is necessary is going to be effective for helping it break through with more folks. I'm gonna take another sip of water. I apologize. All right. So that was really the building blocks of the message, right? The things to think about when focusing on message. So now, before we break, I want to talk a little bit more about both vehicle and audience. So choosing the right vehicle. The first thing I think to ask yourselves is, what vehicles do you have at your disposal? If folks want to drop some examples of things they think are vehicles into the chat, I'm happy to take a look. I think this is basically everything you can think about in terms of when you are communicating with other people, right? And so that includes everything from your social media to your email. If your organization or you have a newsletter, it includes one-on-one conversations. It's a really important one, I think, that folks often don't think as much about, right? Is like, that's a persuasion opportunity. When you're having a conversation with somebody, that is maybe the best persuasion opportunity, and a really important moment to think about, messaging and communications goals. It definitely includes earned media. So as much as anyone on this call is thinking about engaging with the press or doing interviews, community access TV is a great one, right? That is certainly a piece of earned media, but one way that you're reaching folks. And that, all of these are really important, and each of them have sort of their own benefits and their own drawbacks in terms of how you access them, where they fall on that risk and sort of credibility spectrum, but then also the audiences that they are going to reach. So I had this little pop-up here that just has some examples of these. I think I covered most of them. Events is another really important one that I didn't just mention right there. Events are obviously a really important communications opportunity. They're something that, we can control the framing of, that lends that physical credibility potentially taking place, wherever they do. Ads are one, if there is an ads budget or something like that, online posts, blogs. So really anything under the sun that you can think about as a communications opportunity. One thing that I will say about these channels, right, is that there are a lot of them. And I think oftentimes the temptation that folks feel is to try and do everything here, right? To take all of these and have a presence on all of them. And this is especially true, I think, for social media, right? Think about Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat. All of those can be used. LinkedIn is another one. All of those are used in different contexts for political organizing, for issues organizing, for advocacy. And there can be a really strong temptation for folks to try and have a presence on all of those things. I think what I say to folks all the time is really focus on quality, not quantity, right? If the question, again, to continue with the social media example, is, we're going to post once a month on 6 channels or 3 to 4 times a week on one channel, I would always lean towards 3 to 4 times a week on one channel, right? It lends greater credibility. Folks will figure out where to find you. They will know where to go to see consistent messaging from you. It enables whatever limited capacity folks have to be directed in one particular place and not spread too thin. And I think that's just really important because we all have other things going on and other responsibilities. But in terms of, getting back to that repetition piece and making sure that folks are consistently seeing, messaging and communications from people, thinking about, who are your audiences? What are the channels that best reach them? And what is the capacity you have to, populate those channels? And then really narrowing it down to the ones that you think you can consistently use really effectively is a really, really important thing to do as when folks are starting this sort of strategic communications process, again, because otherwise you end up in a situation where there's lots of different channels and not a ton of content. And that can be really challenging from a capacity and a messaging perspective. All right. So then, reaching your audience is obviously another critical piece of this, right? We can enumerate the vehicles until the cows come home. Doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot unless we know or have taken the opportunity to think through which audiences did those reach and how does that match up with the audiences we want to engage. So again, I've used social media here as an example, and this is really sort of a framework for how folks can think about what their audiences are and then work backwards towards the different mediums or different channels or different vehicles, that reach those folks. So, for social media, for example, I've sort of made wild generalizations here for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat. For Facebook, you have the most users, typically a slightly older demographic that is on Facebook these days. With Twitter, you have far fewer sort of raw users in terms of number of people, but it is very, very important with reporters and elected officials. All the reporters are there, so all the elected officials are there. All the elected officials are there, so all the reporters are there, sort of chicken and the egg problem. But in shaping public narratives, it is really, really an important platform. And then Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat, obviously much narrower user demographics, primarily much younger audiences on those platforms. So this is a question for everyone on this call to ask themselves, right? And this is something obviously the Democratic Party and we can be helpful in thinking through if that's beneficial to folks, is who is the audience you are trying to reach, right? And so, that could be as narrow as, registered voters and registered Democratic voters in this town. It could be as broad as, Democrats across the state or across the country. We typically try and stay away from saying the audience is like the general public, because that is so broad as to really not mean anything, right? So we really encourage folks to interrogate that question a little bit more and to really try and drill down as deeply as possible on who their target audiences are and what their demographics are, right? Because that then allows you to say, okay, if my target audience is registered Democratic voters and I know that I have, 5,000 people on our email newsletter, most of the registered Democratic voters, that's the best vehicle to reach those folks, right? That is probably going to be the way that you can most conveniently or most easily communicate with all of them. If you're saying, we really want to reach young folks who are, really online and might be engaged in this stuff, but just haven't been involved with, my organization or anything like that, then it might be social media, right? That might be a place to think about Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat. If you're thinking about, hey, we really want to start framing a narrative with reporters, right? We really think it's important that we get some coverage of this issue. That's a question for Twitter, potentially. And so I think, having those conversations internally as you start this is a really important thing to do to narrow down sort of how you want to be communicating. And to the point earlier about, I just listed there 3 different audiences, 3 different channels, 3 different vehicles. If the feeling is like, hey, it would be great to reach this audience, but we don't have the capacity to run our own Instagram channel or to run our own Twitter or to run our own TikTok or to send out a newsletter. Another really effective way to do this is to think about partners, right? Other organizations or other people that you work with who already have those platforms who might be willing to work with you to engage folks. We've seen that a lot, I think, with a number of different folks we work with who are smaller organizations. They don't have a huge amount of capacity. But they are an environmental org that has a number of colleagues and other partner organizations that do have these channels. They can work together to get that message out there, and that's a really effective way to build capacity and reach new audiences without having to have it all be on one organization or one person. And then the last thing I will say on this, and again, I realize that I'm a little bit over time already, is especially for earned media, having a sort of robust or at least a clear idea of how you want to get that content to the people that you want to see it is really important. I think a simpler way to say that maybe is, 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been much easier to say, okay, you got a front page story in the Boston Globe. Here's how many people read that. Here's how many people saw that, engaged with it, et cetera. Nowadays, given how most people consume news, that is much, much harder to do. So even if you were to get, a piece on WBUR or your local radio station or a piece in the Globe or your local paper, right? It's much harder now to understand how many folks that's actually reaching. So if you're saying, this piece is really great, it explains, this message really well, it explains why people should do X. I really want, all of the people in our network to see this. I really want, this younger audience or this older audience or undecided voters to see this. It's really going to be incumbent upon organizations and individuals to do that outreach, right? To help people, to help make sure that the people you want to see something actually see it. We just can't rely anymore, or as much as we used to maybe, on sort of like legacy newspapers and things like that for people to be organically listening or reading those things. So having an idea whether it's, repackaging earned media content via email or putting it in a newsletter or putting it on social media, if that's where you choose to spend most of your time, having a system down to do that stuff will really help maximize when there is news coverage or, relevant reports or things like that you really want folks to see. All right. Kyle, I see you saying, how do you decide who your audience should be? I'm just going to hold on that one. And Elizabeth, I think that question is related to until we get to the end, and then we will come back because I think that's a really important one and probably deserves a little bit more time. But I see it and we will come back to it. All right. And so then I just want to spend a little bit time, and this is the last slide, and then we'll get into the questions, on what we call bridge phrases. And so this is a little bit more tactical than what we've been talking about to this point, right? This is a little bit more about what would happen if you were in a one-on-one conversation with somebody or doing an interview. We use this a lot when we do interview prep with elected officials or candidates. But I think it's a really important concept to have in mind, right? Which is, in all of these persuasion moments, especially the ones where you have less control, there is the potential for things to come at you out of left field, right? For folks to ask questions that you're not necessarily prepared for, or that sort of take you away from the core messages that you want to be communicating. And so on the right here, you'll see, I think it's like a little, you'll see these 3 little palm trees, which are what we refer to as your message islands, right? So as you're working on defining your messages or the things you want to be talking about, right? Those are your islands. That's where you want to be living as much as possible. And so the way we think about doing that when folks, ask a question or you get some incoming that is, not quite sort of leading organically to those messages, is something we call 2080 and then using bridge phrases. And again, this can manifest differently in different mediums or with different vehicles. But, say, for example, an island of mine is voter turnout is really important to electing more Democrats up and down the ballot, right? And I'm doing an interview or I'm in a one-on-one conversation and someone asked me a question about, hey, what do you think, what do you think of Joe Biden's performance, right? Now, we could talk about Joe Biden's performance for, 5-10 minutes probably, right? But thinking back to the theme of repetition, right? What we really want to do is we want to make sure that the person we are talking to understands what we think is most important going forward, right? So the way we might do that would be to say, look, I think, Joe Biden has done a lot of really good things. Obviously, he's facing some really structural challenges. But, what we're really focused on going forward is, getting more folks, reaching more folks on the ground, increasing turnout, because we think that increasing turnout and growing turnout in these elections is going to be, a really, really important way to elect Democrats up and down the ballot, right? So the bridge phase there was what we're really focused on. But all that does is it gives you a way to pivot out of a question that, you could talk about, but maybe isn't as impactful in what you're trying to get across, and start talking about something that is more impactful, right? Start talking about something that's more message aligned with what you all are trying to do. And so again, that could take different sort of different forms in different places. Like that looks different, obviously, if you're on social media talking with someone, or if you're having an email back and forth, than if you're having a one-on-one conversation. But it's just something to think about, that you are not locked in to a question or a narrative that gets presented to you, right? There is always a way, or almost always a way, to take those questions and pivot them back excuse me, to the messages that you care about, in a way that doesn't dismiss those questions, that doesn't, sort of belittle them or just ignore them, but that still enables you to talk about the things that are most important to you. So I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, as you're doing any and all of this messaging, is sort of how to do that effectively.